So if we look at today's worldwide leading innovative powerhouses that had a profound impact on all our lives, there is one very common story here. And what all of these companies have in common is the way they started. Very quietly, in a garage, with a lot of passion, integrity, paired with skills and also entrepreneurial expertise. This is what made these companies so great. If I go back to the beginning, this was a time when World War II had just ended. Black and white televisions were considered an absolute novelty. And the very first antibiotic, penicillin, was actually making headlines as a modern medical miracle. At the same time, in this tiny garage in Minneapolis, there was Earl Buchan, an electric engineer who very quietly started to repair medical equipment for hospitals. Together with his brother-in-law, Paul Mahammonsley, they were very quickly recognized for their extraordinary skills. Nurses would come up to them and say, "Could you modify this monitor, please?" Doctors would arrive and say, "Could you please build us this tool to help our patients?" And they always did. One day, a very special request actually arrived on the doorstep of Earl Buchan. It was a very famous cardiac surgeon, Walter Lillehei, and he asked Earl, "Could you please develop a battery-powered pacemaker?" Now, this request actually came out of a very tragic and traumatic event that happened back in 1957. If you look at this picture, patients that had irregular heart rhythms, they had to plug these massive external pacemakers into wall outlets. Of course, this meant huge restrictions to their mobility, but also, even worse, they were completely at the mercy of electricity. So in 1957, on Halloween, there was a massive power outage. The lights went out all across Minneapolis, surrounding areas, and that put the patients of Dr. Lillehei at risk. They were depending on these external pacemakers to help their healing after the cardiac surgeries. Even worse, one of his patients, a very young child, pacemaker dependent, he died that night. And this is why he made that request. So Earl Buchan took about 4 weeks approximately to create a battery-powered pacemaker. You can see here the very first schematics, the very first prototype, which we still keep in a little museum to think back to the old days. And this device, what he created, was actually that small that it could be worn by the smallest and youngest of his patients. This is actually the very first child that benefited from this technology. And it truly revolutionized cardiac care. Very soon after, we were shipping the wearable pacemaker all over the world to other physicians as well. Now, this was a quantum leap, and there has been a lot of development in technology in the cardiac space over the last 60 years. And I would like to especially draw your attention to 1960. Only a couple years after, there was the first implantable pacemaker. Now, if you think back in medical history, in the 1930s, 1940s, this was the first time when implants actually started happening. Before that, anything was wrong with you, well, you cut it out. That was it. So the first useful implant actually was a hip replacement. But then came the implantable pacemaker, a really truly interesting implant, because you were putting therapy that was actually very sophisticated in a patient. Now, if you look at this picture, this is probably about this size, a can. They had radio in there, a mercury battery, and what you see here, the tail, is actually an antenna to allow some kind of communication. But it was very big, and development needed to continue. So over the years, there's been a lot more developments in the cardiac and medical space, but most of them really focused on the inside of the device. Obviously, improving and increasing the sophistication by 4 to 5 times, but in essence, the form factor stayed very much the same. It was a can, and it required leads that needed to be threaded into the heart to deliver the therapy until today. So I would like to introduce you to the intracardiac pacemaker. Now you can see how tiny that is, and I'm not sure how well you can see it from the back, but it's actually 93% smaller than the previous generation. Is this concept new? Not really. Already in 1970, a cardiologist, Dr. Spickler, he actually published on the concept, the idea of having something self-contained inside the heart. But it took a few more years, decades even, to have technological advances to make this a reality. So if we fast forward from 1957 to 2013, that was the very first patient that actually received that leadless pacemaker as part of a clinical study in Austria. And you might think that they're related, but they only look alike. But the only thing they have in common is both really mark a beginning of a completely new era in pacing. And you'll be pleased to know he's actually doing very well with his device still today. But what does all of this mean to the patient who's actually receiving these technological advancements? Now, in this case, I can only say that we're truly redefining the patient experience that's receiving pacing therapy. We are reducing complications, and even though standard technology is obviously very safe, very good, but if there is a complication, it's generally related to the lead or the surgical pocket. By design, you have no more surgical pocket, you have no more leads. Also, due to the size, it's minimally invasive. It's basically catheter delivered, you have access through the groin, and you position it directly into the heart. Minimally invasive. No chest scar, no bump. So obviously cosmetics play a role here, but it goes far beyond the cosmesis. There's also a psychological effect of you're not even aware that you have a heart disease anymore. No constant reminder, a bulge, a scar, as you can see on these pictures. And also post-implant, a lot less restrictions. If you imagine somebody who plays golf or a hunter, somebody who has a constant bulge here on the chest, obviously with this, there is no restrictions on their leisure activities any longer. So how was it possible to reduce the size of these devices that dramatically? It goes back to the electronics. So it's all about looking at the batteries, the motherboard, the density. And if you look at the right picture here, on top of the fingertip is the motherboard that is in this device today compared to the previous version. So it is incredible what went into developing something that is barely bigger than a common vitamin pill now. You could ask yourself, okay, you reduced the size, that is great, but what do I have to give up in terms of technology with these devices? And I can assure you the longevity or battery life is equal to the devices that existed before, even though at a fraction of the size. And actually this tiny device is produced down the road. So I would like to show you how much manual and skilled expertise actually go into a device like that. It looks simple, but it's very complicated. device is completely miniaturized, but also our production line had to be miniaturized to actually suit and fit the production of this device. So where are we going from here, really? So far, we've done about 2,500 successful implants across the world. So we haven't even been on the market for a year yet. We just received FDA approval in April. So of course that will open the doors massively to patients receiving this technology. And for me, there's no doubt we're completely at the edge of a new pacing area. And I would even go further to say it's also for other implantable devices that treat heart failure, for example, tachyarrhythmias, and other therapies. Already today, we're pacing for Parkinson, we're pacing for depression, we're pacing for epilepsy. So the pacing is really the foundation of all these therapies, and we're going there with pacing. I mean, the opportunities and possibilities are endless. And I'm sure things are getting even smaller. If I just look at the battery industry, it's one of the industries with the most investment. Miniaturization is key. Combine that with chip technology, different energy harvesting. I mean, again, possibilities are endless. And if I think about the next generation and how we could potentially compare in size or fraction of the size of a penny, where do you even go with that? How do you implant that? Use your imagination. I mean, the opportunities are endless. And then let's think about communication. We all have our smartphones and tablets. I mean, I can't remember the last minute I've spent without it, but it's all around us, and devices, and that is near future. We'll soon be talking to tablets, to smartphones. You can take an active role in your healthcare. So did Earl Bakken back in 1949 think or had the vision that he was going to create a complete medical powerhouse? Don't think so, but he certainly did. Thank you.